the time we live in is a seminal moment for the human race. So I personally feel an enormous amount of clarity at this moment, not in the sense that things are going to be fine, things are going to undoubtedly be terrible, but a clarity of purpose and design. In other words, when it becomes absolutely crystal clear that we're in an emergency and the powers that be are not going to respond to that emergency, then that's a terrible thing, of course, but it's actually a very clarifying thing because we know what we have to do, which is enter into a rebellion. And the good news, and there's lots of good news in what I'm going to say, is we pretty much precisely know how to do it. We've been at this game, in inverted commas, for 2 years now, and I and other designers have been collecting the data from around the world on various civil disobedience events, how people mobilize, how people frame, how people design actions. And I'm clear in myself anyway, and I want to communicate that clarity if I can, about what the pathways to action are and what that means in the American context. So I was sort of half thinking about doing some passionate speech, but you know, my hallmark is to be genuine. So I don't actually feel like doing that. What I feel like doing is just going through really clearly on the assumption that everyone in this call has gone through the anger and the grief. And what we really want to know now is, okay, the plan, right? And maybe this plan isn't going to work, but we need the plan that's most likely to work. So I just want to start just by reiterating with the clarity of the situation we're in terms of the geophysical systems. I think this just focuses our minds to know a few, well, to remind ourselves of a few of the main elements. I've just been doing 50 or 60 talks since we came out of lockdown, about 3 or 4 talks a week in the UK. And there's 3 or 4 key points that we make, you know, over 20 minutes. I'm just going to summarize them. But these are the key elements, I think, that make everyone go white in the room, as we can probably all remember when we did that ourselves, when we first read what's going on, and you had that panic, don't you? That sudden realization that this is actually real and it's going to kill us, or it's going to kill our children. And so what we do in this talk is I make the point that in 2015 at the Paris Agreement, there wasn't a single scientist who privately thought that 1.5 degrees was possible, as has been verified by a number of articles. So 1.5 is done. Everyone's just about admitted that now. I think there was a survey of the private opinions of 100 IPCC scientists. Only 4% of them thought 1.5 was possible. According to Chatham House, which is the most respectable foreign affairs agency and think tank in the UK, there's a 1% chance of staying under 1.5. So then it brings us on to the issue of 2 degrees. So the 2 degrees of warming issue is now, again, I think the Chatham House said 90% locked in. But what's interesting, and I want to just give you this quote, is, you know, this has just come out in Nature Climate Change, one of the peer-reviewed articles. It says, the most optimistic scenario is still insufficient to limit global warming to 2 degrees. So if we translate that into political terms, what that means is the existing political systems around the world, their most optimistic scenario is not going to keep things under 2 degrees. So that's a really important data point, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And I think the third element here is it's now well established But once we go over 2 degrees, there's a high probability, which you can read almost as an inevitability, that we're going to slide up to 3 degrees. And if we slide up to 3 degrees, it's basic science, we're going to slide up to 4 and all the rest of it, for all the reasons we know. And I just want to quote what Johan Rostrom said. So he's the director of the Potsdam Institute, again, probably the most respectable climate research institute in Europe, advises the Pope, German government. So what Rostrom said at COP is, I barely even want to talk about 2.7 degrees. That's, you know, where we're heading according to COP. If we go beyond 2 degrees, it's very likely we will have caused so many tipping points that you probably have to add on another degree through self-reinforcing changes. So basically, we've got this degree of warming that's locked in, and then we've got this point of no return. And the window we have, and this is the critical political analysis, is the window we have, the only window we have now is civil resistance. Because as Sir David King, the former chief advisor of the British government, has said, we have a 3 to 4 window to stop going over 2 degrees. And, you know, scientific euphemisms aside, over 2 degrees takes us up to 3, and that's game over for whichever, you know, there's just a morbid debate after that on whether we're extinct or part extinct. Don't really, you know, the main issue here is the most optimistic scenario does not stop us getting to 2 degrees. The only thing that's going to force governments to take the emergency action to stop getting to 2 degrees is civil resistance, which is the only game in town that rapidly changes legislative programs, right? Short of violent or non-violent revolution. Okay, so really that's the grounding. We know that, but I'm just sort of putting it in nice, stark numbers terms. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as the standard model for civil resistance in the Western world in 2021, 2022. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not like Roger Hallam making this up on the back of an envelope, right? This is the outcome of a collective effort of data collection on what works and what doesn't work. And obviously, I'm not going to go into vast detail around that, you know, all the different data, but I'm going to summarize it because I think it's nice and clear what the key elements are. There's 4 key elements. First of all, that a small group of people have to initiate, operationalize, and manage the civil resistance episode in order to create coherent, strategic coherence, but also coherent operationalization. In other words, there's some people in charge. And they can be self-selecting because they can, you know, initiate it themselves, or of course it can come through an existing movement like Sunrise or XR. But the fact of the matter is, in order to keep the thing together, there has to be a bunch of people that are running the show. And that doesn't mean, of course, that they're running all of it. They're simply doing the top level management of it. The working groups, you know, with media, logistics, actions, mobilization, all have their own semi-autonomy. Okay, the second thing, which obviously is the biggest no-brainer, but has to be said, is that the action has to be seriously transgressive, has to be majorly disruptive. The two main mechanisms that are happening in the Western world at the moment are blocking motorways and going on hunger strike. So there's a success in Germany, for instance, with young people going on a hunger strike that got a debate with the German Chancellor, the most powerful politician in Europe, potentially. There's a guy going on hunger strike until he dies, as he says, in Switzerland, and that's produced a response from the Swiss Parliament, and that's ongoing at the moment. The other thing is motorways, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, the point here is there may be other like games in town, but those seem to be the major items at the moment, and there may be other items when you get to thousands of people. Okay, so the third element is mobilization. So a lot of people engage in disruption, they go to prison and all the rest of it, but nothing happens because there's no systematic mobilization process. So as many of you know, I've been banging on about this for the last 2 years, that there's no point going out to be a hero unless there's a systematic mobilization. And that separates between mobilization within the campaign and mobilization between different iterations of the campaign. So in other words, you go for 2 weeks, you know, with a few people, and then you get more people and you go off and do 50 or 100 or 200 talks, and then you go again, and then you go and do more talks and various sort of forms of mobilization. That has to be systematically organized by a separate team that's not involved in actions, particularly in the early stages. Otherwise, everyone rushes off to the front line like we did in April 2019, and no one's absorbing people. And of course, the holy grail in classical civil resistance is that mobilization drives the action, which then drives the mobilization, and it all happens within 3 weeks. But what I'm talking about here is an iterative model, i.e. you go, you mobilize, you go, you mobilize. The fourth element of it is a popular winnable demand. So again, this is an early stage of civil resistance design, and this comes directly from the US civil rights movement, as many of you know, which is to have a demand which is winnable. Because once you have a winnable demand, the mass psychological payoff for that is an enormous surge in empowerment. Like thousands of people come forward in order to join the civil resistance because of the actuality of a success. So the classic historical example is the Freedom Riders. When they won, you know, the desegregation of interstate travel, that empowered and led to 1,000 civil disobedience episodes or campaigns in the United States, and paved the way for Birmingham and Selma. You know, simplistically speaking, but you can see the direction of travel. So that like demonstration effect, as they call it in the literature, is totally robust. It's been shown over and over and over again. Success provides the basis for more people coming into the street. Okay, so those are the key elements. And obviously, all of them need to happen together to optimize the probability of success. In fact, I would argue that it's useless to not do only 3 of them. You've got to do all 4, and there's no excuse for not doing all 4 in terms of design, you know, given the gravity of the situation. So I'm just going to go through like what happened with Insulate Britain, which was an example of using this model. So it developed the model, but it also relied upon the model to a certain extent, in so much as people in Australia, like they sort of came before us. But because of limitations of time, I'm not going to talk about the Australian example or what's happened in Germany, and to a certain extent in Canada. But just to give you some stats so you get a flavor of how this works, right? Insulate Britain, as you probably know, had a popular demand. Insulate houses in Britain. We have the leakish houses in Europe, and per unit of investment in the UK, insulation produces the biggest reduction in carbon emissions. It's universally popular. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we went with 100 people. So we changed the conversation in the UK with 100 people. This is a key data point, and this can be done in America. It was done in Australia as well. 100 people sit in the motorways 17 times in 7 weeks, right? What that produced statistically is 270 articles in the national press. Being on the front pages of the national press each week, over 60 interviews with national television. And for the sake of argument, 10 million, 20 million conversations. The reason we know we've got that number of conversations is because within the first 4 weeks, the campaign went from 0 to 77% name recognition for a campaign, which is the fastest growth of a name of a campaign in recent British history, right? If you think about it, no one knew about it. 4 weeks later, 77% of people knew about it. This is all a product of disruption. Okay, so what has happened since then is 9 people have gone to prison, 9 more people have gone to prison. So you've got this backfiring effect locking in. 2,000 people came out. to in solidarity, and 150 of them sat in the road. So we now have people going to prison for 3 to 6 months as a result of breaking the law 17 times. Okay, so what that has produced, as the theory predicts, is a massive upsurgence of support within the movement, just like the Freedom Riders did in 1961. That, you know, the sacrifice of it, obviously what's happened in the UK is nothing compared with what happened in 61. But you see this over and over again. I haven't got time to give you like 20 case studies, but it's robust, entirely robust. And what that translates into is two key data points I can give you in terms of Insulate Britain, which is 10 people were involved in mobilisation before IB got going. Now there's 60 people. There's 10 people working full-time and getting paid, 15 part-time people, 35 volunteers, and that's growing as obviously we do more meetings. The second thing is we've raised £100,000, and potentially we have another £100,000 from various donors. And what it's important to understand here, and this is very exciting development, is that the funders are completely on board with this model, okay? So if you can prove that you're ticking those 4 boxes, potentially there's millions of pounds of funding. And I'm not exaggerating. That's what I've been told by a number of funders. In other words, what the funders are interested in is well-managed, systematized mobilization, moving to simplified civil resistance like modules, right? Not like 100 different actions around all little bits of New York or whatever, just simple industrialized civil disobedience. People go on the road, they're arrested, they go to prison. They get on the road, they get arrested, they go to prison. I'm sure David's here, he'll be pleased to hear me say that. Yeah, so this is the classical Gandhi model, okay? There's, as various people and David know, I'm not saying anything new here, but it's about standardizing that, funding it, and organizing it properly. Okay, so obviously what we're doing now is we're going to go on March 21st, along with about 10 other Western democracies that are going to block motorways or depots. Then our new demand is no new drilling for oil in the North Sea, which is obviously a total no-brainer, and everyone agrees with it. We've done about 10 meetings. We're getting 70% of people signing up for civil disobedience training. It's on the go, right? I've just talked to 100 students over the last 3 days in 3 different universities. It's all ticking along. Okay, so what we're looking at in the second iteration then is maybe 500 people being arrested continually, maybe several hundred people in prison, and then that's going to feed through to XR going in April with thousands of people potentially being arrested in order to get over the tipping points. So the tipping point in an average Western democracy is, for the sake of argument, between 200 or 300 or 400 people in prison and around 3,000 arrests in 2 weeks. So obviously translate that to America. My estimates for America are 10,000 arrests, which is what Black Lives Matter had before legislation started appearing on the table. And when they stopped the pipeline, I think there was 10,000 arrests. In terms of people being in prison in America, let's say for the sake of argument, 500 to 1,000. That's what will produce Biden's move. So what we have here is a nice, clear, ruthlessly simplified, like, mobilization plan to get to a tipping point to force legislation, which will then set the country, you know, set the world alight in terms of seeing a success. And I can't emphasize this enough. The prize is for one Western democracy to get a success, right? I mean, Insulate Britain had a partial success. And through that, there are people now blocking motorways in 10 Western democracies. Think what the effect would be to have 200, 300 people in prison, leading to legislative change. Within 2 or 3 months, I am totally confident there'll be hundreds of people in prison in several Western democracies, because people just want to see this happen, right? You know, most people in Western societies haven't seen this happen since the 60s, since the civil rights movement, you know. once they've seen it happen, it will be like an explosion. So keep our eye on the prize. That's what we need to focus on. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to, I think, John and two of the, declare emergency people are talking about the American plan. But I want to just give some of my personal sort of orientations on it. The first thing that needs to be clear, I don't quite know how to say this, so I'll just say it. America is the most important country in the world, okay? There's no point people in Belgium forcing the Belgian government, right, to decarbonize, right? It has to be America. And I know everyone's sort of half smiling about it, but it has to be America. So this is the point. The reason I'm spending like 2 years trying to knock heads together in your lovely country is because if the fucking Americans don't do it, we're all dead, right? You've got a massive responsibility. You've been running around the world, bashing people on the head as a nation for the last 100 years, took over from the British. Now it's payback time. You have to lead the world, and you have to communicate that to the insular American culture, that everyone in the world is looking at you. And if you fuck it up, you're going to fuck it up for everyone. That, I can't emphasize that enough. That's got to be the message. This isn't about America, it's about the world. Obviously, it's about America as well. So, hopefully, what all these activists, I'm speaking on behalf of hundreds of activists here, right? They're going to go and put their bodies on the line. They want to know that America is getting its shit together and they're putting their bodies on the line as well, in a systematic way, right? In a civil resistance way. I'm very aware that that's already happening with the pipelines and all the rest of it, but it has to be done in a way that captures the whole attention of America. And that the way to do that is the way it's happening everywhere else, which is in the capital. So this is revitalizing the original game plan of Extinction Rebellion America, which is to mobilize a lot of people. They go to Washington because it's iconic, right? It's where the media is, it's where the politics is. That's where people need to be. We've got loads of money. If people need to get on a bus, we can pay them, get on the bus, get over to Washington. So that's like the first element of it. The second element of it is don't get hung up about the aim or the tactic, right? The demand is declare emergency. There's pros and cons. That's not what's important, right? The tactic is not that important, blocking motorways, as long as it's sufficient. The key thing to focus on here is the repetition of disruption. In other words, people getting arrested and they have to go to prison. Some people on this call have to go to prison, right? Going to prison is worth 1,000 times just getting arrested. Even in America, I know people in America say happens all the time. It doesn't happen all the time in terms of disciplined, Gandhian-esque civil disobedience of blocking motorways, right? Lots of people go to prison in the UK. No one was bothered. When we blocked the motorways, we had 270 articles in the national press. The blocking of the motorways has to go on day after day after day after day, right? Until people are in prison, or until you stop because your organizational backup is exhausted, right? So the first iteration, I believe, is 3 or 4 times. That's fine. We're just getting the optics. But when you go in January, we need to have 30, 40, 50 people prepared to go to prison. And this is it, right? This is what you need to communicate to all the people you know. This is it. We don't have this chance forever. The whole situation is going to descend into civil war at some point, right? Unless the civil resistance space takes a hegemonic role in the public space. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? You have to go and create a demonstration effect of how radical political change happens. Otherwise, you'll be overtaken by the violent extremes on the left and the right. And you have a limited amount of time to save Western civilization. That's the situation. Okay, so I'll just mention two other things then. Obviously, the mobilization system, XRA has the details. We know how to do it. we can create alliances with other people and share that information, like what might happen with Sunrise or various other movements. The key element, the key difficulty, as you're probably aware, in America, is with all the love in my heart towards you, is you're terrible at collectivity, right? Every time a bunch of Americans get together, they all start like destroying each other, and it all goes back to zero, right? You don't have that luxury, and you have to communicate that. And the way to do that is to combine on an action, on a campaign. So you can all disagree with each other on 101 things, but what you agree is to turn up on the 16th of January, sit in a road, remain non-violent, get arrested. That's it. On everything else, you can disagree. And this is how historically civil resistance coalitions are formed. They're not formed by everyone having the same values, the same politics, They're like, if we don't do this, we're dead. So we're coming together, we're burying our differences for that specific activity. And I think that's what I'll say to the Sunrise people and all the rest of it. And hopefully, as there's more ambassadors take on this process, then there'll be, obviously, it won't be my job. So the good news is, I think I sense for the first time in 2 or 3 years of doing American stuff, there's a new pragmatic seriousness around activism, that we have to do this and we have to get on with it, not least because it's happening in other countries, right? So, you know, I'll just give you 2 or 3 data points. Like, as Ed knows, I'm going to go and talk to Sunrise. Ed's here from Sunrise. There's fantastic people in that organization, you know, and if they're going to take it forward, that's fine. But the argument is, has to be on this model, right? You know, there's a model here to do, so don't reinvent the wheel. So we may do like declare emergency, and then there might be some fusion, and there's a coalition of groups take it forward. This isn't about organizational egos. That's disaster, okay? The second little data point is, I'm talking to New York activists. I'm hoping to have IB presentation for New England activists in the next few weeks. Obviously, the Northeast, as I understand it, is critical in the US because that's the heartland of the civil disobedience tradition. Maybe it isn't, but they seem to be important to me. And obviously they're near Washington. So these are a few little pointers, okay? Okay, and the last thing is the money's there, right? As soon as there's a clear management structure, as soon as there's a clear mobilization system, we can go and get whatever money is needed to pay people to go to Washington, to pay people to work full-time, to create full-time working groups, and obviously to support people post-arrest or post-prison, which is obviously an essential part of the design. Okay, so just finishing off. Yeah, I'm not going to finish with some. I'm in a business-like mood, as you can tell. Right, I'm not going to finish with some rhetorical flurry. You know the situation, right? You know, we all know the situation. This is happening. It has to happen. It's happening all around the world, and I'm more optimistic than ever that it can happen in the US. You know, COVID's there, but it's not destroying the potentiality to mobilize. COP, everyone knows, has basically nailed the coffin in terms of reformist strategies. There's only one option, which is to go and do it. And of course, we all remain enormously pessimistic whether it will happen in time. But that's not the situation, right? It's do what we can, and that's all we can do. All right, that's it. Thank you.